The deafening roar of artillery fire shook the ground, sending tremors through the bodies of the soldiers huddled in the trenches. The acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder clung to the cold morning air, mingling with the faint metallic tang of blood. For Corporal Ethan Raines, this was just another day on the front line, though every nerve in his body screamed otherwise. Ethan crouched low, his fingers trembling as they tightened around the grip of his rifle. He could hear the distant shouts of officers, their voices barely audible over the cacophony of explosions. Around him, his comrades exchanged nervous glances, their faces pale and streaked with dirt. Despite the grim atmosphere, there was an unspoken bond among them, a shared determination to survive the day. The sun began to rise, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield. The desolation stretched as far as the eye could see, a shattered landscape of craters, barbed wire, and the remnants of trees that once stood tall. The no-man's land between the opposing trenches was a deadly expanse, littered with the remains of previous assaults. Ethan's heart pounded as the order came down the line. Prepare to advance. The words were a death knell, yet they ignited a surge of adrenaline. He adjusted his helmet and stole a glance at the photograph tucked into his chest pocket. It was a picture of his wife, Lily, and their young daughter, Clara. Their smiles were a lifeline, a reminder of what he was fighting for. As the signal flare arced across the sky, Ethan and his unit clambered out of the trench. The world erupted into chaos. Bullets whizzed past, some finding their marks with sickening finality. The ground beneath their boots was slick with mud, and worse. Ethan forced himself forward, his instincts screaming at him to dive for cover. To hesitate, however, was to die. He spotted Private Carter, a young recruit barely out of training, struggling to keep up. The boy's wide eyes betrayed his terror. "Stay close to me," Ethan shouted, grabbing Carter by the arm and pulling him along. Together, they pressed onward, weaving through the hellscape. A mortar shell landed nearby, the blast throwing Ethan to the ground. His ears rang, and for a moment, the world seemed distant and unreal. He forced himself to his feet, scanning the smoke-filled air for Carter. The young private lay a few feet away, clutching his leg where shrapnel had torn through his flesh. Ethan's stomach churned, but he pushed the fear aside and crawled to Carter's side. "You're gonna be fine," Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt. He tore a strip from his uniform and fashioned a crude tourniquet around Carter's leg. The boy nodded, his face pale and slick with sweat. The ground shook again as another shell exploded, but Ethan's focus remained fixed on getting Carter to safety. He hoisted the injured soldier over his shoulder, gritting his teeth against the weight. Each step was a battle against exhaustion and the ever-present threat of enemy fire. Somehow, they made it back to a trench, where medics took over. "You did good, Corporal," one of the medics said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. He barely registered the words, his mind racing with images of the battlefield and the comrades they had left behind. The day wore on, a relentless cycle of skirmishes and brief lulls. Ethan's body ached, and his uniform was stiff with dried mud and blood. The unit had managed to push forward, capturing a strategic ridge. It was a small victory, but one that came at a heavy cost. The ridge was littered with the fallen, friends and foes alike, their lifeless eyes staring skyward as if questioning the heavens. That night, Ethan sat with the remnants of his unit around a small fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on their hollowed faces. No one spoke much. Words felt inadequate. Instead, they passed around a flask of whiskey, each man taking a swig in silent tribute to those who would not see another dawn. Ethan's thoughts drifted to Lily and Clara. He wondered if they were safe, if Clara's laughter still filled their modest home. The memory of her tiny arms wrapped around his neck was a balm against the darkness threatening to consume him. He resolved to write to them as soon as he could, though he doubted his letters could ever convey the horrors of this place. The following weeks were a blur of combat and survival. The enemy's resolve was formidable, and each inch of ground gained was paid for in blood. Ethan's unit dwindled with each engagement, their numbers replaced by fresh-faced recruits who looked at him with a mixture of respect and fear. He had become a veteran by default, a role he neither wanted nor felt worthy of. One evening, as they prepared for yet another assault, Ethan found himself standing beside Sergeant Collins, a grizzled man with a perpetual scowl. Collins lit a cigarette, his hands surprisingly steady. "Hell of a mess we're in," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, but we've got to see it through." Collins smirked. "You've got the look of a survivor, Raines. Keep your head down and your rifle ready. That's the best advice I can give." The sergeant's words stayed with Ethan as they advanced the next morning. The fighting was brutal, close quarters that left no room for hesitation. Ethan's rifle became an extension of himself, each shot a calculated act of survival. The enemy's faces blurred into a single, haunting image, a reflection of their own desperation. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan's unit stood victorious over a battered enemy encampment. The cost had been staggering, but the victory was undeniable. Among the spoils of war were letters and photographs taken from the enemy's belongings. Ethan picked up one, a faded picture of a man and his family. He stared at it for a long time, his chest tightening with a mix of guilt and sorrow. The lines dividing them seemed thinner than ever. In the months that followed, the war ground on, but Ethan's resolve never wavered. He fought not out of hatred for the enemy, but out of love for those waiting for him back home. Each day was a step closer to an end he could only hope to see. When the armistice finally came, Ethan stood among the survivors, his body battered, but his spirit unbroken. The cheers around him felt distant, almost surreal. He closed his eyes and let the tears fall, a release of the pain and fear he had carried for so long. Returning home was both a relief and a challenge. The world had moved on, but the war lingered in his mind. Lily and Clara embraced him with tears of joy, their warmth a salve for his weary soul. Yet, at night, the echoes of battle crept into his dreams, a reminder of the price he had paid. Ethan found solace in small things: Clara's laughter, Lily's touch, the quiet moments that reminded him of what he had fought for. He knew he would never be the same, but he also knew he had been given a second chance. And with that, he vowed to live a life worthy of those who had not returned.